Jesus warned me. September marks the beginning of the end. I say those words now and I can still feel the aftershock in my chest. Not the medical kind, but the kind that reshaped everything I thought was real. I say them as a man who did not used to speak in that register. I was a pragmatic engineer, a husband, a father who trusted blueprints and balance sheets more than visions. I died for 11 minutes. That is how I know. My name is Carlos. I'm in my early 50s. I lived most of my life believing that the world ran on cause and effect, on put the right number in the equation and get the right result. I built systems for a living. I solved problems people paid me to solve. I believed skepticism was the safeguard against foolishness. My wife, Marcia, still jokes that I loved diagrams more than dinner conversations. My children, Lucas and Marina, were the center of my life, and yet I lived in a kind of controlled separation, affection and duty, without surrendering the need to explain everything. The morning everything changed, I was at work. It was an ordinary day in a life that had become an anthology of ordinary things. I remember the coffee, the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the schedule of meetings. Then a pain like a tightened fist took me by surprise, and before I knew it, I was on the floor of my office bathroom while colleagues shouted and pressed the emergency button. The next fragments are medical and clinical, a shock from a defibrillator, the metallic smell of antiseptic, the world rushing by on a stretcher. Doctors later told my family I had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. A cardiologist explained the details in measured terms: ischemia, arrhythmia, collapse. 11 minutes without a heartbeat, they said. 11 minutes that medically should have been the end of the story. But what happened in those minutes isn't something a chart can hold. I did not float toward a light like a movie cliché. I didn't experience a montage of memories. I left my body and entered a presence so dense with intelligence and gentleness that words feel crude to describe it. It wasn't a voice at first. It was more like a clarity that arrived inside my mind, as if someone had opened a window and let truth sweep through. I remember thinking, with an almost mechanical surprise, that I could understand things I had never learned, not by hearing them, but by receiving them. It was information and comfort at the same time. At the time, I had no theological label to stick on that presence. Later, after nights of reading, prayer, and wrestling with what I had seen, I understood who it was. Now I believe, with the full weight of what I experienced, that the presence was Jesus. That phrase feels heavy to say out loud, and I am careful when I say it. I'm not handing you a theological treatise.
I'm offering a testimony. The presence that spoke into the deepest part of me carried the character, the authority, and the mercy I have come to associate with Jesus through Scripture and the witness of people I respect. It recognized me, it knew my name, and it left me charged with a responsibility. The moment of encounter was intimate and unmistakable. I didn't hear a sentence like "September marks the beginning of the end" spoken as a headline. Instead, the warning arrived as part of a broader unveiling. Images, if I can call them that, unfolded like 3 screens placed in front of me. They were not metaphor only, they had a sequence and a precision that felt like a timeline. The first image was our digital fabric, the systems and networks that stitch together everyday life. I saw messages scrambling, numbers misaligning, apps misreporting what they were designed to report. I saw a specific mark on the calendar, October 14. I was shown a time stamped in a time zone that reads for me as 1547 Brazilian time. In that frame, devices that should be reliable began to behave in ways none of us would expect. Banking numbers glitched, messages repeated like echoes, and screens captured things they shouldn't have been able to catch. It wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. The scene felt like a signal, a sort of clearing of static that would allow new questions to be heard. The second image, later to reveal itself as a sky event, carried the signature of awe. I was shown a night sky that refused known physics, movement that didn't blur, light that resolved into patterns, a clarity in the minds of millions that lasted for 11 minutes. The calendar flashed October 23, and a time, 21:14 Brazilian time, settled in as a focal point. People who witnessed this would, the vision suggested, experience a sudden and unexplainable certainty about something important. It would be brief, it would be undeniable to those who saw it, and it would leave a residue of changed priorities. The third image was quieter, yet no less consequential. It was a human tidal wave of questions and turning. Between October 28th and October 31st, I saw people waking up, not in the theatrical sense of mass hysteria, but as individuals shifting. Careers would be re-evaluated, relationships recalibrated, priorities reordered. Dreams would synchronize in strange ways. Conversations would move from trivialities to deep questions. The overall sense was that a chain reaction of attention would happen. People would begin to ask why they were living the way they were living, and many would take steps towards simpler, more truthful lives. When I came back to my body, the room smelled like antiseptic, and my chest felt raw from the compressions. Machines beeped. My family was there, Marcia holding my hand like she was gluing me to the present, and the doctors spoke in clinical voices that only heightened my sense of disconnect. To them, I had been resuscitated and was fortunate.
To me, I had been entrusted. The weeks after the event were disorienting in ways I didn't expect. My rational brain tried to file the experience under hallucination, oxygen deprivation, the brain's last grasp at narrative. The doctors politely entertained the question. Neurologists said they had seen vivid accounts in patients who had hypoxia. Some colleagues offered sympathy and quiet skepticism. But facts accumulated that gave me pause. The cardiologist confirmed the precise length of my arrest. One neurologist told me about the patterns of near-death experiences he had catalogued, and a friend who works in signals testing spoke about peculiar data spikes in unrelated systems that week. I do not present these as proof. I report them as the kinds of verifications a once skeptical person like me needed to consider. Outside of my immediate circle, the world kept turning. Yet something in the way I perceived it had shifted. I began noticing confirmations, small at first, then more pointed, that seemed to line up, as if someone had dialed a radio station and the signal became clearer. In September, within a short span of days, 3 leaders in different sectors resigned publicly. Each resignation was unusual in its timing and tone. They were not linked politically, but the clustering felt like a pattern. A region that rarely experiences seismic activity recorded a tremor. People who lived there described the quake in bewildered terms. And astonishingly to many of us in the southern latitudes, an aurora appeared, a green and purple bloom that lit up skies where auroras are seldom seen. These events were written up in local news as anomalies, and they provided what I can only call calibration points. Things I had been shown in a more interior way began to echo in headline form. I say all this with an awareness that correlation does not equal the kind of causation science requires. I am not suggesting the events were proof of prophetic accuracy in a court of material evidence. I am telling you what happened to me and what I then saw. For those who are skeptical, and I understand you because I was you,
Let this be an invitation to listen, not a demand to believe. I will give you the markers I was shown, and you can watch as they unfold. You can also expect to find explanations that don't involve the supernatural. I do not need you to agree with me to be motivated by the same practical steps I will describe later. My family's response was to gather around. Marcia did what she always does. She became a guardrail, a blend of tenderness and straight talk. Lucas and Marina were frightened and curious in equal measure. I had to explain to them as gently as I could that I had seen something I couldn't entirely name, and that I was trying to understand what it required of me. There were people who urged me to keep silent, fearing sensationalism or misunderstanding. There were others who asked for details, for dates, for verification.
That pressure was one reason I delayed speaking publicly until I felt I could report with integrity and with a pastoral care that minimizes fear. After I returned home, ordinary life kept nudging. I walked the dog, I fixed the leaking faucet, I went back into the office. But I also found myself drawn into long stretches of quiet. I sat in the backyard and watched how light slid off the tile, and I tried to trace the memory of the presence without losing it to explanation. The presence had left me with images and with a deeper sense that the world was entering a season of accelerated change. That sense carried urgency, but wasn't the kind of alarm that scatters people into panic. It felt more like a midwife's call. Prepare for labor. Gather your people. Clear the room. There were physical residues from the experience as well. Not miracles in the sense of magic, but somatic markers that made me pay attention. I began hearing a persistent ringing at times, a kind of high-frequency hum that some people dismiss as tinnitus. For me, it arrived with a different quality. It seemed to act like a dial, sharpening in moments of deep stillness and easing when I sang or when I sat with Marcia. I mention this only because it's part of my story. I do not claim it is a universal sign or a requirement for belief. Many who have reached out say they've noticed similar sensations in seasons of transformation. That shared language created a small, emerging community, people writing from different continents, describing synchronized dreams, repeated number patterns, children making unusual statements about where they were before. I read those letters with both the engineer's curiosity and the pilgrim's caution. One of the hardest adjustments for me was to accept that the presence, whom I now identify as Jesus, did not offer a tidy plan for personal safety or prosperity. The encounter was not a promise of immunity from suffering. Instead, it came with a call to moral clarity and spiritual readiness. The warning that September marked the start of something was not an announcement of doom for its own sake. It carried in its texture the language of birth, contractions that precede the labor, noise and disorientation that give way to a new life. To call it the beginning of the end was to acknowledge that certain chapters will close so that other chapters may begin. The presence invited me to be awake and to help others wake. Because I was an engineer and a father, the practical questions pressed in. What does wakefulness look like? How do we help people who are frightened? What does preparation mean without sliding into hoarding or paranoia? Some of the answers came as clear behavioral markers, things the present suggested were helpful. Silence, intentional breathing, forgiveness, formation of small, intimate groups. None of these are exotic. They are in many ways the small disciplines Scripture and wise elders have long recommended. What struck me was the sense that these simple practices would be disproportionately stabilizing in whatever months were to come. I will tell you honestly, when I first tried to speak of these things, I encountered resistance. Scientists offered hypotheses, friends asked for dates, strangers demanded proof. I had little proof to give beyond my body that had been stopped and started, and the testimony of the doctors who certified that stoppage. But I had a responsibility that felt non-negotiable: to speak clearly, to avoid sensationalizing, and to help people center themselves. That sense of duty shaped how I organized the memory of the three images. I resolved to present them not as ultimatums, but as signposts, ways to watch and ways to ready the heart. The first image, the digital anomalies centered on October 14th, puzzled me longer than the others. As an engineer, I could imagine plausible system failures. Networks fail, software bugs propagate, and outages occur. What unsettled me in the vision was the specificity and the symbolism. The systems that fail in the picture are the very systems that give us daily assurance, pay rule, communications, identity validations. The presence didn't tell me to panic or to withdraw cash and barricade myself. Instead, I was shown communities relearning how to talk face-to-face, neighbors who learn each other's names again, and families restoring simpler ways to confirm truth: a phone call instead of a forwarded screenshot, a neighbor knocking on the door instead of relying on a notification. In the days after, as I started to share cautiously with friends, odd confirmations arrived. An acquaintance who runs a small bank network in another state called to ask whether I had experienced anything unusual. He said they had seen a strange log entry traceable to a timestamp near the one I remembered, an anomaly that their engineers shrugged at but could not fully explain. He would not call it prophetic confirmation. He simply reported the data as a scientist might. Another friend in information security mentioned that some apps were showing duplicated timestamps and message echoes. Again, not proof, but a ripple consonant with what I'd been shown. As I began mapping the interior revelation to exterior events, I felt the gravity of responsibility to frame everything carefully. The presence had not provided a checklist for survival. It had offered a spiritual diagnosis. The world would enter a season where old assurances would crack, and people would be forced, by small or large interruptions, to choose what matters. For some, that would be an opening toward repentance and renewed life. For others, it would be a hardening into fear. The presence invited those it spoke to. When it spoke to me, it was intimate and urgent, to be agents of calm, steadiness, and relational repair. There were nights I wrestled with whether to tell my congregation, my colleagues, the wider public.
Marcia would sit across from me and say, "You have to be careful with how you say it. People will pick the parts they want and ignore the rest." She was right. I knew there would be people who would weaponize dates, or who would turn warnings into marketable products. That was a temptation I wanted to avoid at all costs. The presence had been clear in tone. Prepare hearts, not bunkers. Love, not hoarding. Speak to soften, not to scare. One memory I return to often is how the presence treated the question of certainty. I remember thinking, how will people know? The answer I received was not a set of fingerprints or a method, but a sensibility. The things revealed would carry a moral clarity that made inward decisions simpler. Imagine a situation where a person who has been living on autopilot suddenly feels with painful precision that their marriage is hollow, or a corporate executive who, confronted with a sudden anomaly in business models, asks whether pursuit of profit has replaced genuine care. The presence indicated that the coming signs would not merely be external events, but catalysts for interior reorientation. That is the thing that scared me more than any headline. The real work would be inner work. After I recovered strength enough to stand and walk, I started a small practice to hold myself accountable to that inner work.
I did not invent anything mystical. I reduced the noise in my life. I limited news consumption. I sat in silence for short spans, breathing with attention. In those quiet moments, I sometimes heard the hum again, felt the ringing ease, and sensed a clearer compass. I tried these steps privately for myself before recommending them to anyone else, because I knew from experience that people are more likely to follow a practice if they see it steady a real human being. Before I go further into what the other images held and how September's anomalies fitted into this inner map, I want to pause and say something to anyone listening who is skeptical or anxious. If this feels like a pattern of apocalyptic sensationalism, I get it. There are too many false alarms in the world. There are too many voices that seek to profit from fear. I do not want to be one of those voices. My task in telling this is not to convince by spectacle, but to bear witness to an experience that changed my life, and to offer practical, non-alarmist ways to prepare our hearts and communities. If this message is landing with you in a way that stirs something, curiosity, unease, or a small flame of attentiveness, subscribe and turn on notifications. I will be sharing responsible updates as things unfold and offering concrete, faith-rooted practices to help people stay steady. That is the only invitation I will make here. If you want to follow along carefully and soberly, press subscribe. If not, feel free to go on with your day and treat this as an unusual but sincere account from someone who lived through something unexpected.
When I look back at those first post-resuscitation weeks, I see a pattern emerging, an inner reform and a cautious external cataloguing. I was talking to people who had seen odd things in dreams. I was reading emails from parents who reported their children saying strange, lucid things about before. I listened to scientists explain anomalies in terms that made sense in their field, while also admitting they could not fully account for certain spikes in measurements. Each piece was partial, a datum rather than a verdict, but together they suggested a rhythm. The presence had given me 3 images. One was a technological tremor, one was a celestial sign, and one was a human reorientation. Each would have markers in the world. Each would demand a different kind of response. I began to sense 2 groups forming in the cultural currents around me. One group responded by searching for practical tools, like those I later began sharing, to stabilize heart and household. This group wanted to build small networks of trust, check on neighbors, and practice simple disciplines like forgiveness and intentional silence. The other group doubled down on cynicism or denial, insisting on business as usual and treating claims like mine as curiosities at best. That polarization is not new to human history, but it felt sharper after my return. The presence had warned, not in the tone of condemnation, but in the tone of urgency, that the division between those who would tune in to deeper realities and those who would dismiss them would become more pronounced. I also learned, sometimes painfully, that personal testimony invites scrutiny. People wanted specifics, timestamps, corroborating footage, external witnesses. I tried to be as transparent as I could without turning the sacred into spectacle. I showed the cardiologist's notes. I discussed the clinical timeline. I shared the internal consistency of the vision sequences and the resonance I felt with certain events that had already occurred in September. I published nothing sensational. I named dates I had been shown, described patterns I had observed, and made clear that these were my experiences, not universal proclamations. As the month of September unfolded into its end, the confirmations I had mentioned earlier, the unexpected resignations, the isolated quake, the aurora, accumulated in a way that made me more insistent on speaking. I am not asking you to accept these as signs of absolute prophetic precision. I am sharing them because they were the kinds of things that to someone like me suggested calibration.
If nothing else, they altered the scale of my caution. I could no longer treat the inner vision as merely private, it had public resonance. There is a deep pastoral truth I want to make clear. Warnings are not the same as condemnations. When the presence, who I now identify as Jesus, brought those images, the tone was one of compassion. The aim was to wake people up so they might live more fully, not to throw them into terror. That difference matters because fear fractures communities and ruins rational decision-making. My purpose in sharing what I was shown is to help people orient their hearts towards steadiness and compassion, not to promote fear-driven reactions. Now, as I prepare to tell you more about the specific signs tied to October and the practical adjustments I tested personally and with others, I want to stop here so you can take in what has already been said. This is not the end of the story. It is the hinge between what happened to me and what I believe is being called for, a joining of an interior summons and an exterior season. There are more details to come, including clearer markers for the 3 visions and a set of 5 practical steps that I have seen steady people in the face of uncertainty. I will share those, along with cautionary wisdom about how to avoid fear-driven responses and how to cultivate community that softens the blow of upheaval. For now, remember this. I did not expect to speak like this, and I did not expect anyone to believe me instantly. But I am certain about 2 things, that I encountered a presence I now understand to be Jesus, and that I was entrusted with a warning wrapped in an invitation. Prepare your hearts, gather your small groups, and listen with a humility that resists both panicked reaction and dismissive certainty. After I asked people to subscribe and hold space with me, I owed it to them and to Marcia and our kids to be precise in how I walked the rest of this out. The visions I'd been shown did not feel like speculation, they felt like a pathway of attention. So I began tracking. I started keeping a notebook by the bedside, jotting times I felt the hum, phrases that surfaced in dreams, and the names of people who reached out with similar experiences. I called a few friends in technology and in emergency services, not to find validation, but to learn what I could about what would actually happen if the first image, October 14, began to unfold in the world. The morning of October 14, as the date in my memory approached, I slept fitfully. My sleep was threaded with fragments, an echo of the presence, a phone screen splintering into multiple panels, a neighbor's voice walking across a courtyard to confirm a detail face to face. I don't want the poetic voice of my memory to make this sound theatrical. The thing I had been shown was ordinary people relearning how to be present with one another when small systems stopped being reliable. The vision's machinery, the corrupted timestamps, the doubled transaction records, the repeated notifications, translated in my waking life to very human consequences: missed payments, confusion over appointments, the anxiety of missing a message that felt urgent. On that day, friends did begin to report strange behavior in apps. Message threads displayed duplicate entries, automated transactions posted and then reversed without adequate explanation, and a few small businesses saw receipts that listed impossible timestamps. Engineers I know described odd log files, echoes that didn't line up with usual failure modes. They shrugged, they patched, they moved on. A bank network operator told me he saw a short window of anomalous entries that matched, almost syllabically, the timestamp my vision had impressed upon me. He was careful with his words. He said, "Carlos, we see weird things all the time. This was weird in a way that made our team sit up." To me, these were not proofs. They were calibrations, data points that a once rational man could not ignore. What mattered more than the mechanics of the glitch was the human behavior it produced. In several neighborhoods, people who depended on delivery apps or on digital confirmations found themselves knocking on doors and talking to neighbors. Small acts, taking a neighbor's number in writing, forming a group chat with a local bakery owner, began to appear in messages I received. A pastor friend sent a short voice note that morning. "You will laugh at this, but we had 3 families show up to Sunday service because they didn't get their ride notifications. We made coffee and stayed."
The presence's first screen had felt like a diagnostic, an interruption to return us to direct accountability. 2 weeks after that, the second image, the sky, moved from an inner tableau to a public puzzle. On October 23rd at 21:14 Brasilia time, reports poured in from disparate places. People called my phone and left breathless messages. "Did you see that? My kid is talking about light." I watched footage people sent, grainy, sometimes beautiful, often perplexing. For many, the best way to describe it was that the sky behaved like a carefully choreographed hymn. The movement did not smear or blur, lights resolved into patterns and then into a stillness of attention. Countless viewers described a sudden internal clarity, an experience like a bell being struck in the middle of a busy room. The noise did not vanish, but priorities did. I have no interest in theological novelty or in giving this phenomenon a label beyond what people felt. Millions have watched the heavens and seen displays that move them toward gratitude, dread, curiosity, or surrender. What surprised me and what mirrored the length in my vision was that the clarity persisted for 11 minutes. People say time dilates in moments of significance. For those 11 minutes, many described a condensation of meaning, a sudden ability to see what mattered most without the usual filters of image and desire. Respondents included scientists who wrote cautiously about atmospheric lensing and optical anomalies, journalists who emailed me to say they were receiving hundreds of eyewitness accounts, and families who said they cried because something inside them had been resolved, not by argument, but by a felt conviction. I want to be careful here. It's essential for me to say what I believe and to be honest about what I do not claim. When I say the presence I met was Jesus, I am giving language to what integrated with my Christian faith and made coherent the warmth, authority, and mercy I experienced. When I tell you that many who witnessed the October sky reported an internal, undeniable clarity, I am reporting the testimonies that were shared with me. That clarity does not equal doctrinal conversion overnight, nor does it guarantee support systems for what comes after. Instead, it opens a window. Some people will step through it, and others will not. The third period, October 28th to 31st, was quieter in spectacle and louder in decision. Those days were not defined by one big viral event, but by the small ruptures that lead to trajectory shifts. I received messages from people who had, overnight, asked hard questions and then acted. A mid-level manager texted me that she walked out of a meeting and never returned to the project that had consumed her evenings. A teacher resigned and said she was returning to a rural village to teach basic literacy. A man in his 70s told me he had finally asked his estranged brother for forgiveness. These stories do not add up to a single political or social movement. They add up to a moral reprioritization. The image I had seen, a slow human tide of turning, played out in small ways across many lives. Accounts of synchronized dreams and number patterns continued. I want to emphasize that experiences like repeated numbers or shared images in dreams are deeply subjective. Many people find them spiritually meaningful. Others see them as coincidence. If you experience such things, treat them as invitations to reflect rather than as mandates for radical action. Ask a trusted friend, bring them into a prayerful conversation, test them by scripture and wise counsel. Discernment matters because not every impulse is a call and not every pattern demands a leap. As these confirmations and personal changes accumulated, I began to notice a cultural split in my own circles that matched what the presence had shown me, two kinds of responses emerging. One camp sought stabilization, neighbors forming check-in groups, small churches opening their doors, families writing down important phone numbers and meeting places. These people often paired practical steps with spiritual disciplines. The other camp responded with ridicule or complete denial, mocking posts, cutting off conversations, or doubling down on normal routines without any buffer for surprise. I do not judge either group with contempt. They are human responses.
Some will be right for the conditions that come. Others will learn in harder ways. The presence's tone toward both was patient and persistent. People were invited to wake, not coerced. Given all this, the question I hear most is, what do we actually do? The presence did not hand me a checklist for survival. It offered practices that steady the heart and restore relational capacity, tools that help without promising immunity. Over months, I refined 5 concrete steps that I have seen repeatedly steady people in my circle. I practiced them with Marcia and with a handful of friends and watched them reduce anxiety, increase clarity, and cultivate community. I share them here as tested habits, not as rituals that unlock spiritual guarantees. First, reduce noise. Practical translation, set a daily window of media fast and a weekly digital Sabbath. For me, the daily window is 2 hours in the morning when I do not check news or social feeds. I discovered that the first hours after waking set the tone for the day. If I spent them reacting to headlines, fear multiplied. The weekly fast is at least 24 hours where we minimize screens at home. We turn our phones to airplane mode for the evening and sit in the backyard, sometimes with neighbors, sometimes alone. The effect is simple. Fewer spikes of anxiety, more space for prayer, conversation, and listening. This helps people respond rather than react. Second, cultivate heart coherence. This is not esoteric when described plainly. It is a short breathing practice that calms the nervous system and helps you access better decision-making. Here's a simple way I teach it. Sit comfortably. Breathe in slowly for 5 counts. Hold gently for 5 counts, and exhale gently for 5 counts. Repeat this cycle 5 times, twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, or whenever turmoil rises. It sounds almost too simple, and yet I watched a friend in emergency services use it in the middle of a chaotic shift to steady his hands and then make a clearer triage decision. It is not a magic bullet. It is a micro-practice that increases your capacity for presence. Third, trust and test intuition. The presence asked me to notice the small promptings in my body, the way my stomach tightened before a conversation that would go badly, or the quiet pull toward a phone call that mends a relationship. Intuition is not an infallible oracle. It is a faculty that improves with training and with community feedback. When you experience an inner nudge, pause and consult a trusted friend or mentor. Ask, "Do you see this?" Invite accountability. For example, a woman in our community felt an intuition to check on a neighbor. She felt silly but followed through. She found a person who needed a meal and a listening ear. Intuition, tested in community, becomes a practical tool. Fourth, clear relational debts. Forgiveness and honest confession are not sentimental. They are methods of clearing the heart's clutch. The presence emphasized the moral weight of reconciling where possible. For me, that began with sitting down with Marcia and saying things out loud I had held back. It continued with apologizing to colleagues for being too rigid or too distant. This step is often the hardest because it asks for humility. It does not promise that all relationships will heal, but it loosens the knots inside you so that you can move without bitterness clouding decisions. Fifth, form a small tribe of 3 to 5 people. The presence used the metaphor of a labor room, small, intimate, present. I have seen this work repeatedly. Groups of 5 meet weekly for prayer, practical check-ins, and skills exchange. One group in my town set a simple agenda. Share one thing you're grateful for, one thing you fear, and one practical need where someone could help in the next week.
They rotate childcare, ride-sharing, and meal drops. These tribes are not cult-like cells, they are ordinary networks of mutual aid and moral accountability. If you're worried about safety, start with 2 friends and commit to a single check-in call each week. Over time, these small circles become scaffolding for the larger community. I want to give a brief story that illustrates how the 5 steps can work together. A young teacher named Anna reached out after October. She had been overwhelmed. Her school suddenly shifted to hybrid learning. Her father was ill, and her relationship had frayed. She began a 2-hour morning media fast, started practicing heart coherence for 5 minutes before class, and joined a small local group of 3 mothers who agreed to swap childcare for 1 evening a week. She also sat down to write a letter of apology to a friend she'd been avoiding. Within a month, she reported less anxiety, better sleep, and a surprising clarity about whether to change jobs. She didn't see all problems solved. She said the practices simply made her capacity to choose clearer. That is what prepared people for the weeks that followed. Not panicked survivalism, but increased capacity to love and to act responsibly. Along with practical steps come signs and symptoms people should be aware of, not as badges of spiritual authenticity, but as potential indicators of an internal shift. Some of these are physical, persistent ringing or pulsing at certain times, vivid dreams that feel like conversations, a sudden uptick in déjà vu, or repeated numbers that show up in meaningful ways. Others are social, dreams that multiple people report in similar language, children making unusual comments about before, or neighbors suddenly asking deeper questions. I have been careful to avoid treating these as deterministic. Many explanations, medical, psychological, cultural, can account for similar phenomena. If you experience persistent, disturbing symptoms, for example, hearing persistent voices, intense dissociation, or severe sleep loss, please seek medical and mental health support alongside spiritual guidance.
Discernment means engaging both prayer and professional care. Discernment also means testing prophetic impressions. When someone claims a large public prophetic word, the measures I would use are simple and faithful. Does the message point people toward humility and love? Does it align with the witness of Scripture and the character of Jesus as mercy, truth, and justice? Does it guide people toward shoring up community rather than fueling panic? I have said and will say again, the presence that visited me was marked by mercy. Its instructions were pastoral. If a message you encounter promotes fear-driven hoarding or moral superiority, treat it skeptically. Over the weeks that followed October, I found myself returning to a few biblical anchors, not to make my experience a doctrinal treatise, but to place it within a tradition that has long known seasons of wakefulness. Jesus said in the Gospels, "Watch and pray," Matthew 26:41, and Revelation gives the image of one who stands at the door and knocks, Revelation 3:20. Those images fit the tone of the presence I met, an invitation to wake and an offer to open the door. I do not claim novelty by linking my vision to these texts. I claim continuity. For those who stand within a Christian framework, the call to wakefulness is not a brand new information. It is a perennial summons to live awake to love. There is a pastoral nuance I must insist upon. To prepare your heart and community is not to guarantee you avoidance of suffering. Many of the most faithful people in history endured great trials, and that reality did not mean their faith was misplaced. The presence I encountered did not say, "Do these 5 things and nothing bad will touch you." Instead, it said, "Be awake, be reconciled, be generous." It asked that we enter the future with more capacity to love others through whatever comes. That brings me to something practical that often gets overlooked: resources for those who find themselves overwhelmed. If you are feeling paralyzed by fear or by the sheer volume of what you think might happen, start small. Take one of the 5 practices and make it daily for 2 weeks. Invite one trusted person into a short weekly call. Limit your news consumption to a single reliable source for 15 minutes a day. If your anxiety grows beyond what you can manage, please contact a mental health professional. Spiritual preparation and mental health care are not at odds, they are complementary. I also want to address the question of public testimony and responsibility. When I began telling this story, some people asked why anyone would make such an announcement public. The simple answer is because the presence that visited me felt like it wanted the possibility of wakefulness to be more widely available. I struggled with how much to share. Marcia reminded me that our family's safety and the dignity of neighbors mattered more than spectacle. So I chose to speak in a way that would not sensationalize dates or weaponize fear, but would equip people to tend to their hearts and to one another. That is why my emphasis has always returned to community practices, to small houses of fellowship, and to humility. Since those weeks, I have been traveling, quietly, mostly, to meet with small groups, to listen and to learn. I sat in a hospital chapel with a nurse who described feelings she'd been unable to name. I met with engineers who offered non-theological explanations for anomalies, yet said the human stories they heard were unassailable in their emotional truth. I participated in a small neighborhood watch that became more of a mutual aid hub. These encounters taught me that the most reliable response is ordinary kindness, showing up, bringing a meal, offering a listening ear. The presence's urgency did not call for grand gestures, it called for proximity. People ask about leadership, who to follow, which voices to trust. My practical guidance is modest. Follow leaders who embody humility, transparency, and a willingness to be corrected. A trustworthy leader is one who listens to experts when needed, who encourages seeking professional help, who centers the vulnerable, and who models sacrificial service rather than self-promotion. Beware of charismatic solutions that promise certainty or a single path to safety. The presence I encountered did not give me a VIP map, it gave me a vocation to steady others. As the months moved on, I saw communities that took gentle, preparatory steps while remaining generous to others. One church in a nearby town organized a neighbor night where people swapped contact cards, practiced a brief 5-minute breathing exercise, and recorded in a communal binder the names of elderly neighbors who needed weekly check-ins. The binder was not a survival manual, it was a mechanism for care. In another place, a small co-op started a rotating list of meals for families in crisis. These are not dramatic interventions, but they are the kinds of scaffolding that hold communities together when systems are strained. Let me be blunt about one temptation: profiteering. There is a market for fear. People will sell gadgets, subscriptions, or exclusive groups that claim protection. I have seen offers for courses that guarantee a form of spiritual activation, packages that promise to decode dreams into prophetic calendars, and paid alerts that claim insider clarity. I urge caution. If a person's message leans toward fear that motivates purchasing or exclusive gates, it's worth a serious pause. The presence I met leaned always toward inclusion and love. It asked for our hands and our presence, not our wallets. Toward a theological reflection that is brief and I hope helpful.
Christianity has long navigated the tension between warning and comfort. Prophetic voices in Scripture called people to repentance so that communities might return to justice and mercy.
Pastoral voices comforted those worn thin by the struggle. My testimony sits in that tension. I offer warning as an act of love and comfort as an act of hope. The presence that spoke to me was not a messenger of gratuitous doom, but a midwife to a new kind of attentiveness. If you find all of this heavy, or if it sparks immediate questions in you, you are not alone. Many of you will test these things slowly. Some will find the 5 practices useful immediately, others will sit on them for months. Both responses are valid. If you are skeptical, I invite you to try the simplest practice, reducing noise, for 2 weeks and observe how your heart and decisions change. If you are fearful, take the small shelter of community. Call one person, not to be dramatic, but to ask how they are doing. Little acts of mutual care are the most stabilizing currency right now. Before I close, I want to return to what was given to me in those 11 minutes. Not a prophetic monopoly, but a guarantee of safety, but a vocational summons. The presence I now identify as Jesus entrusted me with an appeal to prepare internally and relationally. It was a call to wake, to repair what is broken in private and public life, and to practice mercy in small, concrete ways. I understand that many people will read this and feel no call. Others will feel it as a weight. Either way, the invitation stands. If you are moved and believe this message could help others, do one thing now. Share it with 3 people who need a word of preparation and encouragement. If you haven't yet, subscribe for careful updates as events unfold. I will continue to report what I see responsibly and pastorally. If you feel called, type October in the comments as a simple way of marking that you are paying attention. I will read those comments and hold them in prayer. No hype, just care. My hope for you is simple, that you might find steadiness, that you might gather a few faithful neighbors, and that you might live in such a way that when storms come, whether literal, digital, or relational, you have a heart trained to act with compassion and clarity. The presence I met offered no easy escape from suffering, but it did offer a method for loving more clearly in the middle of it. I close with a benediction that is not clever, but true. May your ears be open to the gentle nudges toward mercy. May your circles be tight enough to catch you when you stumble, and may your hands be ready to offer bread and not just theories. Whatever comes, some of us will be beacons of steadiness, lighted not by fear, but by the deliberate practice of presence. Thank you for listening. Share this with 3 people. Subscribe for sober updates. We will keep watch together.